Fresh off the back of updated safeguarding rules, the Department for Education has released long-awaited guidance on relationships, sex and health education. There is good and bad and plenty of grey area. So to help sift through it for us is John Denning, our Head of Education. John, thank you for joining me today. There's so much guidance floating around at the moment. Why don't we first of all just clarify what we're looking at today?
Yes, so we're talking about guidance for schools in England. And there are three pieces of guidance for schools in England that we've been concerned about. One is a safeguarding guidance that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. The second is this guidance that we're going to be talking about in a minute on relationships, sex and health education, so on what schools actually teach on these topics. And we're still waiting for guidance for schools on gender questioning children, how schools should respond pastorally to and practically to children who are questioning their gender in school. So we're still waiting for that third one.
So if people are wondering, hang on, you haven't really talked very much about gender, that's still to come.
Yes, well, I mean, there is content in here about what schools teach on gender, but how schools respond practically in their care for children who are questioning their gender. That was partly addressed actually in the safeguarding guidance, but we're hoping anyway that there's more to come on that.
So let's dive in, I think, to I mentioned that there's good and there's bad and there's a grey area in between, but why don't we talk about some of the positive aspects that we see in this guidance?
Yeah, so one of the big issues that's been talked about a lot is transparency. Schools being transparent over what they're teaching. And of course, you'd expect schools to be transparent with parents. I mean, schools are teaching children on behalf of parents. And to be fair, you know, in terms of our experience of working with parents who've got concerns over what schools are teaching, in most cases, schools are open. If parents are concerned they want to see what the school's teaching, schools are generally happy for parents to see. And that's what you'd expect. But there have been cases, and we have seen cases and dealt with cases, which are really quite concerning, where schools are trying to keep secret what they're teaching. Sometimes with the encouragement or at the request of third-party organisations that are providing materials to the school to use in their provision of sex education. And obviously that's completely inappropriate. It's not respecting the role of parents, and just fundamentally, it should be just a clear principle of safeguarding that there should be no secrets over what children are taught about sexual matters in school.
And that the way that sex education resource providers were doing that and refusing to show things was all under this idea of, well, this is our copyrighted material, we don't want someone taking it away and plagiarising it. But I mean, that seems pretty far-fetched, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And that was certainly one of the excuses that was given. Now, this was addressed in letters that the Secretary of State sent to schools back in 2023, but then on the Department for Education website where those letters sit, there was a big notice was introduced at the top saying, you know, this was produced under previous government, sort of implying that this is no longer valid. But it's great that now the equivalent wording is there in this guidance, in the statutory guidance, instructing schools that they must allow parents to see materials. They've got to be transparent and open with parents about what they're teaching. So that's a really valuable element in this guidance.
And they've even gone as far as to say that contracts which say, you know, we've got to keep this secret, we can't show this to parents, they've said that that's all null and void, unenforceable. So that's
right. Yeah, positive. That's right. And in general, actually, there's a greater caution over third-party materials. I mean, the guidance itself, the current version of the guidance from 2019, which will still, in fact, stay in force until September 2026. The schools have got a year to get ready to implement this new guidance. But under that guidance, there were actually third-party resources suggested and examples given within the guidance itself, some of which are really quite concerning. That's all gone. And now the guidance says that schools should be particularly cautious about using resources from organisations that have a strong partisan view on a contested topic. Schools should ask to see materials and lesson plans in advance from any external providers that are coming into the school, and should seek the views of parents, making sure that all materials can be viewed by parents. So that's actually a great step forward.
And what are some of the materials that we're talking about here that people were concerned about, which were being used, which now can't be used?
Yeah, so partisan views, really that's any time where schools are promoting a particular view, but it's a view which everybody doesn't share. And they're not giving a fair representation of the different views that exist, including the views, importantly, that parents hold. Schools shouldn't be undermining a parent's view to their child. They can present different views, but shouldn't be undermining it. So especially in this relationships and sex and health education, that's been about things like teaching on gender, which we might come back to in a minute. Also, just generally sort of promoting quite a liberal attitude to sex and relationships that doesn't really recognise Christian views, for example.
And where does the likes of Christian views, religious belief, how does that all fall into it?
Well, parents have an important role, and so parents who have a religious belief and other beliefs about these matters, they should be invited by the school to contribute to a consultation. The schools have a legal duty to consult parents whenever they first write and whenever they review their policy on this, and they have to have a policy on relationships and sex, technically not on health education, but in practice, schools will probably cover everything within one. Schools must consult parents. And a consultation means really engaging with parents. The new guidance says that schools must be proactively engaging with parents and consulting them on their policy, on their approach. And so parents who have particular views on this, including Christian parents with religious views on this, can raise those with the school. The school must provide education on this which is age appropriate and is appropriate to the religious background of pupils. So the consultation is a key opportunity for schools to understand the religious background of pupils and to understand parents' views on what's age appropriate as well. So it's an important input that parents have there. And the guidance says, as indeed the current guidance does, that religious views can be discussed in any schools. There can be discussion and debate on controversial issues. And all that, I think, is saying to schools, look, you shouldn't be just promoting a single perspective on an issue. You shouldn't be promoting views with which some parents are going to disagree.
Mm. And in terms of this sort of time of consultation, really, you said that the guidance comes into effect September 26, and so in the interim we've got another year of using the 2019 guidance. But you think that actually during this next year, schools are going to be formulating their policies, they're going to be working on how things are going to work from September. So actually, this is not a case of wait until next September to see what's going to happen. Actually, parents need to be engaged now.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it would be, a school would be very quick off the mark if they started consulting parents this coming September 2025. But I think certainly once we get to January 2026, schools are going to be thinking about revising their own policy to bring it in line with the new guidance. And when they do that, they're going to need to consult with parents. So parents need to be really alert, I think, to that. Although the guidance tells schools to be proactive and try to engage parents, I've seen last time round plenty of examples where schools send out a weekly newsletter within which there is one line that mentions there's some kind of consultation, and then parents have to sort of click that, and then they're taken somewhere else and click on something else and they're taken somewhere else, and eventually they find the consultation. So it's easy to miss. Hopefully most schools will do better than that, but it's something for parents to be alert to, I think.
Understandably, parents have often been quite concerned about the rights of withdrawal from these kind of subjects. Previously, it's been the case that parents can withdraw children from sex education, but not from relationships education. But we know that there were also concerns about things which essentially are sex education being taught under the guise of relationships education. Now, the 2024 guidance that we had from the Conservative government made a much clearer line between the two and said, if it is sex education, even if it's being taught within relationships education, you can still withdraw your child from those lessons. Is that still the case in this guidance?
Yes, so the law hasn't changed. This is guidance, not law, and the rights of withdrawal are set down in law, and they've been the same since September 2020. As you say, parents can withdraw their child from sex education, but not from relationships education, and not from health education either. The problem with that, of course, is how do you define what's relationships education and what is sex education and what's health education. Now there was the draft guidance you mentioned that came out last year, which a lot of supporters on our mailing list will have responded to that consultation on that draft and will have seen that draft, and that drew a much clearer line between sex education and relationships education. And it said that relationships education should not include topics which involve explaining different forms of sexual activity. Though it did include provision for children receiving in primary schools to receive education to help them recognise sexual abuse, but without going into any detail. And the final version of the guidance that we now have keeps that mostly, slightly qualifies it, but basically it's saying the same thing. So it says relationships education doesn't involve explaining the detail of different forms of sexual activity. So they've put that word detail in. I'd prefer if they just kept it clear and categoric rather than putting that word detail in. But I still think that's helpful. And if you have examples of schools that are just trying to teach everything in class, everything is relationships education to get round a parent's right to withdrawal, I think a parent quoting that would be effective because it's still clear in saying, that the detail of sexual activity shouldn't be part of relationships education.
You mentioned there about younger children being taught certain things but not being given explicit details about different things. Now, the draft guidance talked about children not having any sex education before they're 9 years old, and older children, sort of teenagers, 13 years old, you weren't allowed to hear about explicit sex education until you're 13. The national newspapers have sort of seized on that's not in this guidance. So what's the situation now?
Yeah, so I think that's concerning. I mean, that comes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that the draft guidance was much clearer and categorical, and it has been, to an extent, watered down. There's still useful things in this new guidance, but it's concerning that some of that has gone, that was there in the draft, and it remains to be seen whether this guidance is really clear and strong enough to counter the really quite concerning approaches that have grown up in some schools. So yes, that's absolutely right. The age limits have been taken out. The government says they think it should be up to the discretion of schools to decide when is age appropriate. That doesn't mean that schools have a complete carte blanche, though. Again, there is this distinction made in the guidance between relationships education and sex education. There are general comments within the guidance, and there's of course the duty in law for schools to provide education which is age appropriate and to consult with parents, and I think part of that consultation should be gaining parents' views on what is age appropriate as well. So we're not left with nothing on that topic, but yes, it's much less clear and categoric because those age limits have been removed.
The Education Secretary said that they didn't want there to be age limits because it might prevent schools from broaching topics a little bit earlier if they felt it was necessary. What kind of things are we talking about?
Yeah, so I don't really agree with her there because the draft guidance did allow for that. It did allow for schools in particular circumstances. For example, some schools, you have this problem of sexting where children are sending explicit images of themselves to one another with mobile phones. That has been known to happen even in primary schools occasionally, sadly. And you can see in that situation, the school will need to address that in some way. We'll need to say something to the children, and it needs obviously to be mindful and careful how it approaches that. And of course, most schools, I hope, would be mindful and careful how they did that. But that's the sort of situation she has in mind, I think. But in actual fact, I think the draft guidance allowed for that kind of situation anyway.
Moving on to maybe some of, we said there was good. And there are some areas where there's a bit of good and there's a bit of bad as well. So just looking at the LGBT content and the things about gender, what does the guidance have to say about those?
Yes, so again, the draft guidance was very categorical. Schools should not teach the concept of gender identity. And that's been watered down to some extent. But to look at it positively, this new guidance is still better than the 2019 guidance, which is in force at the moment. So it says, schools should be mindful that beyond the facts and the law about biological sex and gender reassignment, there is significant debate, and they should be careful not to endorse any particular view or teach it as fact. For example, they should not teach as fact that all people have a gender identity. Many schools have been doing that. I've seen the resources that are widely used in many schools, including in primary schools, even though actually the current guidance doesn't say anything about teaching gender in primary. But many of those resources do teach as fact that all people have a gender identity, while this guidance forbids that. It says schools should be mindful to avoid any suggestion that social transition is a simple solution to feelings of distress or discomfort. That's a very, very important point. So there have been examples of teaching that's really encouraging social transition, that talks about people being distressed because they think they're born in the wrong skin, in the wrong body. This is suggesting, well, actually, you shouldn't be encouraging peoples to think that they can just identify as the opposite sex and that's a solution to all their problems. That's not the case. And particularly with primary schools, there have been concerns over some of the resources on gender identity. The genderbread person is perhaps the most well known. There are a number of similar resources, kind of cartoony sort of resources used in primary schools that present a whole sort of theory of gender identity as if it's just a simple fact, and here it is. Well, the guidance specifically says when schools decide to use external resources, they should avoid materials that use cartoons or diagrams that oversimplify this topic, that perpetuate stereotypes or encourage pupils to question their gender. And schools should consult parents on the content of these resources in advance and make all materials available to them on request. So there's some really helpful content there. It may not be quite as good as what we had in the draft, but it's still a really significant step forward from where we are under the current 2019 guidance.
And what about things like teaching about all sorts of different relationships?
Yes, so that's an area where we've still got concerns about the position of this guidance. The law actually requires the Secretary of State in writing this guidance to write it with a view to ensuring that pupils learn about marriage and its importance for bringing up of children. The guidance mentions marriage, but only in the context of, this is one kind of relationship. It talks about the importance of stable relationships, the importance of commitment a little bit, but it's presenting all kinds of relationships, heterosexual relationships, homosexual relationships, all kinds of relationships really that are consensual on an equal basis, and failing really to recognise the objective evidence of the benefits of marriage. There's masses of evidence on its benefits for children growing up with married parents, and it's a real, I think it's really letting children down to not make them aware of that, because these are the most important decisions, some of the most important decisions anyway, they're going to make in their lives about these relationships, about forming a family, and they should know the facts. And the guidance does nothing to encourage schools to tell children those effects. Obviously, it needs to be done in a sensitive way. Schools shouldn't be criticising parents' family relationships to their child. It needs to be done sensitively. But I think children should know the facts about the stability of different relationships and the consequences of that for children growing up in that family.
Because that's a narrative that we hear quite a lot, really, isn't it, about consent. So long as people consent, then everything's okay, you can do what you want, so long as everyone consents. And people have said, if two adults consent, that's fine. But there's also been talk about children who are below the age of consent engaging in sexual relationships with one another. And that has been in the news a little bit recently as to should there be prosecutions, how should that be dealt with? Does the guidance have anything to say on the age of consent?
It does mention it a few times, actually perhaps more times. It has more mentions than it does in the 2019 guidance. So it's encouraging that that's in there, that schools are meant to be teaching about the age of consent to children. And it says that RSE will enable young people to make their own choices about whether or when to develop safe, fulfilling and healthy sexual relationships once they reach the age of consent. And it talks in other places about teaching about the age of consent. So at least that's in there, and that's helpful.
And I just want to also talk about faith schools as well, because a lot of Christian Institute supporters will send their children to all sorts of different schools, but there will be some people who send their children to Church of England schools, other faith schools, schools with Christian ethos, things like that. How does that all work?
So all schools, whether they're fee-paying, state-funded, of all kinds, they're all bound by essentially the same law. It's in slightly different places technically, but it says essentially the same thing. And they're all required to have regard to this guidance. So essentially it's the same for all, but the guidance does acknowledge that faith schools will have particular perspectives. It says that all schools can teach about religious perspectives on these things, and there can be debate over different views, and different views should be respected. So I think a school with a Christian approach, it can have a Christian approach to relationship, sex and health education. It will have to cover some of the topics that are in the guidance, but it can cover those from a Christian perspective.
So that's quite good on teaching about the age of consent, but we also know that there have been materials, there's been teaching which encourages early sexual experimentation, and we've seen all sorts of terrible materials on those kind of things. Does the guidance have anything to say about that?
Yes, it does, and I think in a way it's helpful. Again, like most of this, it doesn't go quite as far as you'd want, but it is helpful. So the current 2019 guidance says effective RSE, that's relationships and sex education, does not encourage early sexual experimentation. And we've always said that should say effective RSE must not encourage early sexual experimentation. That's the wording that would be better. Now, the new guidance doesn't say that, but it does say effective RSE focuses on respect for oneself and others and does not encourage or normalise early sexual experimentation. I think the insertion of that word normalise is helpful. I think schools should be looking at resources and saying, well, does this normalise early sexual experimentation? If it does, it shouldn't be used. And again, if parents are seeing materials that they think is normalising early sexual experimentation, then they can point to this paragraph in the new guidance, and I think that will be helpful.
There's been a big focus in the last few years with online safety, and the Online Safety Act is to protect young people, protecting all people from seeing harmful content online, but particularly young people. And one of those things that they want to protect young people from is from seeing pornography online. And we're hoping to see proper age verification introduced soon. But what does the guidance have to say about pornography?
Yes, so it encourages schools to teach about pornography. We think if you're going to teach about pornography, it should be clear, teaching about the damaging effects of pornography, both for the viewer and for those who are involved in producing it and often trafficked, exploited in order to produce it. The guidance doesn't quite go as far as that. But it does say that the secondary curriculum should cover how pornography can negatively influence sexual attitudes and behaviours, including by normalising harmful sexual behaviours, and can also portray misogynistic behaviours and attitudes which can negatively influence those who see it. So again, doesn't go quite as far as we'd want, doesn't quite put it perhaps as we choose to put it, but still it is encouraging schools to present pornography as to warn children about pornography essentially, which is the right approach fundamentally.
And so we are 2 bits of guidance down, 1 to go, gender questioning children. Are we expecting it sometime in the course of the summer holidays?
It may well appear. I hesitate to say that because it's been about to appear for so long. I mean, the Department for Education has been working on this for years and years and years and years. But their intention, I think, is it comes out this summer. And encouragingly, this final version of this Guidance on Relationship, Sex and Health Education actually contains a link to the draft version of that guidance, which at the time was, really strongly criticised by trans activist groups, by some of the teaching unions even. But the link to that draft is here in the statutory guidance, final version of the statutory guidance on relationships, sex and health education. So clearly the government's not trying to disown that draft guidance. And that's an encouraging sign, I think, that a final version of that guidance may be around the corner, and then that link that's in this guidance will change to a link to the final version. Who knows what it will say, but yes, it may well appear soon.
Well, thank you very much, John. That's been very helpful. For more great content, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.